Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Michael Rapici.
Dr. Barry
How are you
Falk.
tonight? How are you tonight?
I feel like I'm in a monster truck rally, to be honest with you, but otherwise,
No.
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Certainly a lot better than last night when we had our pre-game show, our typical talk to sort of prepare us. And I was thinking, the last thing I want to do in my life is to take the Turing test. But what a difference. What a difference a day makes, or day breaks. Um, I am definitely full of beans tonight, and I'm happy to be with you on this Zoom chat that we're going to share with folks. And we're going to indeed, critical media studies will indeed take the Turing test, or at least talk about the Turing test.
We'll talk about it a bit, though I guess we can leave it up to all you listening to decide whether or not there's actual humans on the backside of this.
That is going to be a part of our discussion of Mr. Jefferson, but
You know,
I don't want any spoilers here.
Can I offer just a quick sort of detour for a second? That's really fascinating. I was listening to a podcast the other day, earlier this week, and they did something. So it was a podcast on coaching, and the guys that do it, one of them has just published a book. And he was like, listen, we did this really interesting thing that we can't wait to share with you. I fed my book into AI and then asked AI to put together a podcast. And they did an amazing job. And so we're just going to play the AI generated podcast based on the book for you to enjoy. And it was really interesting because, you've got a man's voice simulated and a woman's voice simulated to sound like a conversation that's going back and forth. And it literally, I would not be surprised if they just fed the book in the chat GPT and said, use this as source material for a podcast. Right. And so they played the what's the word I'm looking for? The fake voices, if you will, in conversation with each other for like a 35-minute podcast. And so we had a little Turing test where both participants were machines, right? It was terrible.
No joke. I thought you were going to say that.
No, they thought it was fantastic. It was really interesting. I think they were very taken with the fact that the machine was able to assimilate a couple hundred pages worth of, really pretty interesting stuff and fairly complex stuff in places, and to turn it into a discussion that more or less worked. I mean, there were a few garden variety AI mistakes where they're talking about running and he switches it to throwing a baseball or something. But the idea, the through line was clear enough that it did, the content that they fed it didn't suffer, but it was terrible. And so let's hope that we can do better.
Well, we are not feeding this into ChatGPT. We're doing an analog in that respect. Michael, okay, let me just give the mildest or the quickest of bumpers here. Just to explain to listeners and viewers. I guess you're not a viewer because you're just seeing a blank screen if you're a viewer, but to listeners, that the subject of this week's episode is the October 1950 article by Alan Turing, the now legendary Alan Turing. I think you're a legend. Once Benedict Cumberbatch plays you in a biopic. So I think he's a legend now. Alan Turing, mastermind, no pun intended, of computer thinking. His article entitled "Computing Machinery and Intelligence," in which he does articulate the now famous or infamous Turing test for intelligence as a test of measuring intelligence. That's our subject for today, continuing and probably culminating our six-part series. I think something like that, six-part series on artificial intelligence. And we thought we would, kind of go to a classic, certainly an influential text. Okay, now before I let you, and I think Mr. And Dr. Rapici is
Don't
going
do.
to do some driving here. But before we do that, I have to do a follow-up question about your
Yeah,
ChatGPT.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know if you explained why it was terrible, because it sounded like things were technically proficient.
Yeah.
So
So,
what
and I
was
think this
terrible?
is
And
this.
why were
So,
they so amused if it was so
so
bad?
I'm gonna answer the question now, and I think that its relevance to the discussion at hand will sort of hopefully slowly unfold. You'll see it because your head is already here, but from an informational standpoint, I think that so just for clarity's sake, right? The podcast hosts are the author and a person that he works closely with who would be familiar with the content of his book, though he didn't write the book, right? And the author of the book was really taken by this. And I couldn't tell exactly because he didn't talk too long about it. You could tell he was really, really, to use your phrase, he was full of beans about this because I think what it had managed to do in probably very short order was ingest a significant amount of technical content and turn it into a conversational form that posed both questions and answers
Oh, that is sophisticated, right?
as a
Yeah.
reasonable facsimile of a conversation that he and his co-host would have had normally. Okay.
Well, that is amazing.
So it was from a technical perspective, it's very fascinating that it happens, right? If you just look at the nuts and bolts of what's taken place, you say, wow, that's really an impressive display of computing power and artificial intelligence. It rang conversational, and my annoyance with it has nothing to do with the admittedly obnoxious tone of voice and fake surprise and everything and all of the embellishments that the computer puts into it. It sounded like a cheap conversation between stupid people. And I don't mean that to be negative. The book is interesting. I can't wait to read the book. It's not that the book's not interesting. It's not the content's very fascinating. But what it did was it added a tone, and I don't mean the
Mm,
linguistic, the audible tone. It added a there was a dimension to the content that I think came as a necessary component of the AI influence,
mhm,
which which just cheapened it down. And I think that what happened is if you understand that these are algorithms that have modeled language from, a billion different sources and have
right.
decided, well, this is how we put conversation together, anticipating the Turing article that we're going to talk about here in a
Mhm,
second, it didn't get it wrong at all. Every colloquialism was correct. The only places, and I listened to it for about 15 minutes before I just had to stop. The only places that it got wrong was where you could tell it was filling in, oh, we're talking about sport. I'm going to fill in the wrong sport here and use an analogy that certainly the author didn't use, but for, you know, content purposes, you can still figure out what's going on. There was just like an AI sheen that ruined everything.
mhm.
And it's sort of like it was just a weird version of what we're talking about here with the Turing test and intelligence. Like, um, yeah, I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it'll come to me as we go
Well,
on.
I want you to, you have a wonderful outline that you're going to talk through, and I will try to speak in the interstices. But let me use something you just said apropos the podcast as a way, if I may, and I'll keep it brief, as a way to introduce, now we're going to talk about Turing.
Let's.
Um, because something you just said um, is let me use this as a sort of a way of framing our entire discussion. If I had to come up with a sentence that summarizes Turing's intent in computing machinery and intelligence, it has something to do with the sentence you just uttered, Michael.
Okay.
Um, that he is very consciously trying, Turing is very consciously trying to separate intelligence. So let me go back to the sentence that you that sparked this thought that you said. You are imagining, if I understand your criticism, you were saying it was a conversation, all right, but it was a simulacra of conversation that was somehow not quite like a human dialogue or conversation. It was like a conversation, but not quite a human conversation. Now, that in a word or sentence or so kind of is what this article is all about, that Turing is trying to systematically, methodologically, working through objections, myriad objections, um, myriad objections, so many of them that we don't have time to talk about them in
Hmm.
the podcast, but working through many objections, I would say his main purpose is to somehow separate, to convince the reader that intelligence and thinking can somehow be detached from human faculties. So that I felt like what you were saying about the podcast, that
That's
the AI gives you a conversation. It's giving you intelligence, but what you were noticing is that there's some disconnect from the human. Well, that, according to Turing, is the whole point, it
it.
seems.
So I think that my problem with it, and I think you're absolutely right, is there are these sort of definitional spaces
Mhm.
that Turing is looking around and through. So the space between thinking and intelligence,
Indeed.
and
Indeed. Right.
and where the differences between those two sort of lay, and then how close we need to get to one to pass off as the other, and then also in any given context what your intent is,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
For me, it was sort of like the difference. You know, you could talk about the difference between information and knowledge, right?
Right.
The
Right.
nuts and bolts are there, but it's how are you assembling them, putting together. But I want to be clear. I don't think this is a question of aesthetics.
Mhm.
I haven't put my finger on it yet.
I know. Well, I think that's a really important point. And I didn't phrase it well, but I was trying to get to that point. I wasn't just saying, some of the arguments that we've been talking about, I would think Labatut. I think in his case, I think he basically is aestheticizing the difference between human thought and human narratives, and I mean by using the category of narrative. I think he is trying to introduce an aesthetic element, but I'm not trying to do that, and I didn't think you were trying to do that.
No, but
I
to
think
that
you
to
and I
that
are sympathetic to Turing's project, which is to separate the human from the thinking from human faculties. But that doesn't, if you're uncomfortable with that, or if you have an objection, oh, goodness, okay. I'm talking myself into a mess, but I'm
let me
just
say
saying
one
it's not
thing.
about aesthetics.
Well,
It's not about
so
aesthetics.
I think and then we'll jump into this, but this is as good a jumping off point as any. One of the distinctions that Labatut was sort of playing with
Right.
is, I don't know, you want to call it like an emotional aesthetic that's tied
Sure.
to the use of language,
Indeed. Indeed.
right?
Right.
Turing, in his objections that we're going to talk about, plays with that. But again, it's sort of like, well, is a facsimile of this passable for the real thing? And where do you draw the line between
Right.
the two? So, what I've done, so this is, you know this, but for those of you listening, what I've done is I have basically drawn up just a bullet point outline that follows Turing's argument start to finish. And so what we're going to do is just talk through his argument as it develops and sort of have a conversation about the things that we find interesting. And I think it's important to note that this is like the machines and like the humans. This is not fully planned out to the point where we are going to be glitch free or error free, which I
There
think
will
we
be
could argue
surprises. There will
is
be
the
surprises.
locus of theoretically of intelligence or learning or memory. So we're gonna go and do this. So um, the title of the essay is "Computing Machinery and Intelligence," and Turing starts out with the question, "Can machines think?" And then he quickly rephrases that question to say, "Can a machine?" That the question, "Can machines think?" could be reframed as, "Can a machine play the imitation game?" So for him, thinking becomes the ability for a machine to be mistaken for a human being. And then he follows it up by basically saying, is this even worth investigating? Like, why do we need to bother this? And he
Mhm.
says that it is because this helps us distinguish the physical and intellectual capacities of man, that man can't pretend to be a machine ultimately because he's too slow and inaccurate to do so. So this helps us understand uh, his limits and therefore the potential of the machine. The objection to that, he says, machines could do something that looks like thinking, but is somehow different. That's the objection that he poses, right? That the problem here is that, well, if we do the imitation game, couldn't a machine fake it convincingly? And Turing's response to that is a giant sure, but if it can, so what?
May
Absolutely.
interrupt and add something to this point because this particular argument is Turing makes a move that he's going to repeat really throughout, actually.
Right.
At certain points in the argument, he will anticipate the objection. Well, this is looking like thinking, but you can't really prove that it is thinking. All that I will concede, he's imagining an imaginary interlocutor who says, okay, yeah, maybe the machine could do the imitation, but the fact that the imitation looks like it's thinking, it's not really thinking. Now, at every point, this is the first point, but there will be many other places. Whenever he always reacts to that move with the counter question of, as you mentioned, or the counter statement, as you mentioned. So what? Um, Basically, his premise is if it looks like thinking, we're going to have to grant a computer is thinking. And yeah,
So my question, if
yeah.
I think part of the reason for this is that the Turing test ultimately comes
If it
down to
looks like it's
perception.
thinking, I am going to say, Alan Turing will say, it is thinking because, and I
Well,
don't
that
want
because
to, yeah,
that's
go
the
ahead.
name of the game, right? Can I make you think? Like that's I think
Can I
that's one.
make you, can I fool you?
Yeah, and that I think is, and I don't know whether that's because in this way the article is a bit anachronistic, whereas it becomes frighteningly prescient in others.
Hmm.
Um, but the idea is not to actually create a thinking machine. The idea behind the Turing test is to create the illusion of a
Yeah, a
thinking machine.
simulacra.
Yeah.
And he wants to, whenever we get to the point of saying, okay, all we're really agreeing on here is that it's a simulation or a simulacra of thinking, he'll swoop in and say, that's enough.
Big
That's
thumbs
what
up.
we're looking for.
We're
Bingo,
moving on.
thumbs up. We're moving on.
Right.
So what I just wanted to interrupt you there to say, and to say this is a kind of repeated trope or repeated move he
Right.
makes throughout the article. And when we get to a little bit later, when we get to I can't remember his first name, but Professor Jefferson's argument. When we get to the Jefferson argument, I want to we'll stop there again because it's unclear why Turing is so insistent on this move of saying Do you agree that it's a simulation of thought? Okay, it's thinking. Let's call that simulation thinking. We'll make it when we
Well,
get to the Jefferson bit, it will become clear why he says you have to concede, dear interlocutor. If it looks like thinking, it may as well be thinking.
but
And
Barry,
we'll
not
get to
not
that
not to
later.
give the big secret away early here, right? But I
Oh,
think
you want to do
there's two
that?
things to think
Yeah,
about with this, right?
yeah,
And that
yeah.
explain it. So maybe it's worth talking about now. One, as we've said earlier, he's not a scientist. He's a mathematician. And I don't mean any
Gee.
offense to the mathematicians out there,
Oh my God, we just
but
lost so many
we
listeners.
lost all of them. But he's not a scientist, and he talks at the towards the end of the essay about probability being worth
Yes.
following. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. Bingo, Michael. Yes,
so,
please.
okay, so we'll continue with his line of thought as it occurs in a linear fashion or
That's
semi-linear
a great
fashion.
point. Let's not undersell your genius move there. Really, what I've been trying to talk about is probability. Whenever he gets to the point where he imagines his interlocutor, his imaginary interlocutor, saying, well, it's possibly true,
Yeah,
or it's probably true.
there's a tipping
The
point for him.
mathematician in him, yeah, exactly, tipping point. The mathematician in him says, okay, we're done.
51%, I'm good. We're going. Right. Okay, so as we've now explained in significant detail, oh, close enough is close enough, right?
Close enough is close enough.
So he's talking about the computer, and he says basically to program a computer to do a certain thing well, you have to write a program and install it, right? So um, the machines will do what the program tells them to do. He says if we program randomness into a machine, it would look like free will
Mhm.
because it would be unpredictable. And if it's unpredictable, then that seems to be one of the hallmarks of free will for him. He says, however, if you program something like pi, that would look random, though it's not, and therefore would look like free will. So he's found a potential way to create randomness that is not random.
Mhm.
And he
Mhm.
says, however, most computers have a finite, what he calls a store or a memory bank, or
Mhm.
they are limitations. They can only do so much, and therefore you can't truly fake randomness. You could plot out the pattern if you go long enough and then realize this is not random.
I do have to do a small insert here because I think, and I think this is worth mentioning because you're talking about randomness,
Right.
and Dr. Rapici, you're very correct to say he's a mathematician, not a philosopher. That said, this conversation about randomness, um, even though he's not a philosopher, he is working within a decidedly recognizable philosophical framework. And I think it's important to mention this because it is kind of framing all his observations here. He doesn't believe in randomness. He believes that he's a behaviorist, pretty much. He believes that there is seeming randomness, but that in human behavior as well as machine behavior, randomness can be, if we zoomed out, randomness would reveal its pattern so that we
Well,
experience as humans.
right. So when you
So
talk
there is
about,
a philosophical determinism here.
so let me ask you a question about that then, though, because if you talk
Yeah,
about patterns, when I hear him talk about randomness, what I'm hearing is predictability. Can I predict what will happen?
of course.
And right. And so he's saying that if you had something that, like pi, for example, but if you had the means of tracing it out
All the
indefinitely,
way out that it's predictable. Yes.
it would
Right.
still be so so 'cause
Yeah.
I didn't catch that. My understanding with this was that we can't achieve true randomness because there are physical limitations.
Oh, that's what I'm saying.
But
That's what determinism is.
no, I understand that. Thank you though.
Oh,
But what I mean is,
oh, what do you mean?
um, are you saying that his position here was that true randomness, even outside of the physical limitations of the machinery, is not a thing? Like, is there no philosophical space for randomness for him?
I think not. Yes. I guess that is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Is that he has basically a mechanistic. That's what I'm calling about. That's what I'm calling deterministic. Uh, it's a chain of cause and effect. Even if you don't realize, and he's not rigid about it. And once, I mean, he understands that we may have the feeling or things may have the appearance of freedom, of randomness, and in our own lives. Turing would admit that, would concede that we have the experience of free will. But a philosophical determinist would say if we had the ability to zoom out, we would see the ways in which our seemingly random free activities are, in fact, being constrained by conventions.
Okay. Well, he would have loved big data.
He would have loved big data,
All
sure.
right. Well, in keeping with that, he moves on to talk about what he calls discrete state machines, which he says work in definitive clicks that would allow us to understand their limits and thus their outcomes ahead of time. So this is the move against randomness. Argues that we could predict their conclusions accurately. And so what I understand he mean by the discrete state machines are machines that serve a singular purpose. However you define singular, they are not dynamic in nature. They do a thing. Um, that thing, whatever it is the program that governs the machine's behavior. So he says that digital computers are in fact discrete machines because they operate according to a set program. They
Okay.
can be changed, but at any point in time, it is a discrete machine
Mhm.
with, depending on the machine, I suppose, a potentially very large state. And he says that while they can do tremendous things, we can still know what they will do. So to your point, that there's this idea of randomness or free will in a machine is not in play because they have their limits. So any computer can mimic a discrete state machine, and any computer can be programmed, to mimic any particular
Mhm.
discrete state machine. So he says the question, can machines think, should now be replaced by the question, are there imaginable digital computers which would do well in the imitation game?
And boom! The bomb goes off, and we have 2025 because he argues that in 50 years, we will have these machines. And boom, we're off. We're off, basically. 1950, we're off,
Right.
right?
We've blown past it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
He says that in 50 years, an interrogator will not have more than a 70% chance, right? That an interrogator would miss 30% of their interactions with machines and think that they were human.
One of the articles in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy noted this as a measure of the success of the essay and of Turing's prescience. That when he was writing in 1950,
Mm-hmm.
to use it was something to just use the term machine intelligence because it sounded oxymoronic or it
Blasphemous
sounded
even.
blasphemous or just crazy stupid, something, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were all these stigmas against it, from coming from different directions. It would either be ludicrous or blasphemous or just plain wrong or certainly counterintuitive. And a measure of one indication that we're living in Turing's world is that that's probably the least objectionable thing about this essay right now. This idea that there is machine intelligence, we all know that, right?
Yeah. I think that there's the objection. I imagine that the objection even 75 years ago would have potentially been managed terminologically. And I
Sure,
think that it's fun because as we get to, now that blur is much more complicated.
sure.
Um, at any rate, he said in 50 years it'd be much harder to tell. And then he comes up with a series of objections. And you and I want to speak, there are nine. You and I want to speak to two of them directly.
Indeed.
Um, I
Yes.
will quickly name them, in
Please
case
do.
anyone finds any of them interesting. They can go back and dig at their own.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I'll
Please.
give a very brief gloss of the objection, but we're going to run through the one.
Sure.
Okay, so number one was the theological objection, which basically says God gave brains to men, not computers, so no.
And he
Okay,
says, basically, God could do, okay, I do like his, can we do this just a little bit?
yeah.
I do like his counter argument. It's like, well, if God is omnipotent, why can't he give a brain to a computer? Shut up.
there's there's a fair bit of shut up at the end of a lot of these. The second one, my one of my favorites, the heads in the sand objection, which is basically like, hey, this is really scary, so let's just pretend it's not a thing that we have to talk about, which might speak to
That's
some of the
the
objections,
2025.
but
That's 2025.
we're still doing that now, right?
Yeah.
The third one is what he calls the mathematical objection, which basically says that sure, machines are going to make mistakes, but no man could ever possibly triumph over all the machines. You can't prove everything. This gets to that sort of tipping point
Probability
probabilistic
tipping
thing
point, right?
again. He says that basically fine, but the imitation game provides a basis for discussion, and that's good enough. Number four comes knocking at your door. This is the first one we want to come talking about. This is the argument from consciousness.
Yes.
And this is interesting um, because I'm not really sure. Like, I kind of need you to help me tease out his response to this.
All right, let's do
So
it.
he says, and I guess he's riffing off a Professor Jefferson here in
Right,
1950.
right,
He says,
right.
the argument says that not until a machine can write from emotions that it has felt. So it has to write something because the machine, felt something, not because of randomness. And then in turn has to feel something as a result of what it did. That would be acceptable to talk about machine learning. And Turing says, okay, fine. But the only way to be sure that a machine is thinking is to be the machine and feel oneself thinking. And you can't
And
prove I'm wrong.
and I'll interrupt to say, because I think this is going to answer you. You said you had a quasi question. This is where CMS is taking the Turing test because basically what he would say is the only way that you know
Is if
I'm
you're a machine.
thinking, huh?
Is if you're a machine.
No, 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 no. Before we go to the machine,
Okay.
before we go to the machines, I think this is how I think he's arguing. You tell me if I'm, you know, see if this jibes with your reading, but this was my reading of it. This, I think, is one of his most ingenious arguments. Now, like we've been saying, the argument doesn't resolve in a doesn't resolve. He doesn't resolve the argument,
Right.
but he feels that he reaches a tipping point or at least a stalemate against the argument. So let me go back and just say work through your point A. So, and this is Professor Jefferson. I will need to figure out his first name here at some point here. Although the Stanford Encyclopedia says that Mr. Jefferson was a kind of a loser, they regarded him to be a loser and they wished he had engaged
He'd
and
gone
taken
somewhere
side.
else.
Did you see that? The wish he had. But anyway, so contemporary scientists and theorists of consciousness. So Jefferson says, um, okay, machines can't write sonnets because sonnets are not just thoughts. They're in shades of Labatut. Sonnets aren't just thoughts. Literary forms aren't just thoughts. They're feelings.
Right.
And so the reason I know that I can write a sonnet, well, no, sonnets are feelings. And so and therefore, humans can't feel, or rather, machines can't feel, so they can't write a sonnet. So Turing's response to this is think of what you just said. What you're saying is a machine cannot feel because because it can't express its feelings. A machine is not telling you it feels, but in a way, there is no difference. So he doesn't argue that, but he's saying that essentially we take human beings on trust. When Professor Jefferson says I felt something and I wrote a sonnet. That's one way of looking at it. But all we have for Professor Jeff, all we have to back up Professor Jefferson's statement is his own avowal of
That he
his
felt something.
feelings, that he
Right.
felt something. There is no way I can prove that within my consciousness. I would have to literally be in, this is Turing's point, I would have to literally be in his consciousness to verify that what Professor Jefferson says is true. And just let me say one thing, and then we'll see this. The
Hmm.
final bit of the argument is this, and I'm going to connect it to critical media studies. What he says, because I think this is actually a very, very brilliant argument. Like I said, it's not conclusive, but it's really powerful. Where he says, look what you're doing to believe Professor Jefferson is saying the truth, we would have to have we would have to be able to prove what he can never prove, which is that he felt something along with the sonnet. What we do, and Turing says that's what we're doing in every conversation. So what I do, what you're doing to me, is I'm assuming you're thinking. Why? Well, I'm assuming you're thinking and feeling, but I'll never know what you're feeling. Only you know what you're feeling. All I'm doing is, well, I guess Michael is human because his thought is an expression of his feeling, but I
Let
can
me
never see it. I'm taking it on trust. And then he's saying, if I take Michael Rapici on trust, why can't I take a machine on trust?
so let me go a step further with that. And by the way, it's Jeffrey Jefferson, who was a professor of
Oh,
neurosurgery at the University of
oh,
Manchester.
thank you.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome.
And the family of the Jefferson family is thanking you here.
So here's my question for you, though. And I think this further maybe argues at Turing's point. It's not we cut the objection short. Jefferson argued that not until a machine can write from emotions that it feels, right? So it has to write something because it feels something,
Indeed.
not because of randoms, but then it also has to feel something as a result of what it did,
What it created. Yes,
right? So
absolutely.
the computer has to write a sonnet because it felt something, then read the sonnet and feel something
Feel
as a
something
result of
again.
reading it.
Yeah.
So would that then add fuel to Turing's position to say, well, if this possible human, possible machine responded to me and provoked an emotion in me via that response, that I'm that much closer to this
To
being?
humanity. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. The main thing, like I said, he feels he cannot. I mean, one of the reasons why he's dealing with these myriad objections is that he's very honest about this and open about this. He feels he can't prove his argument. So the best thing he can do is take on and answer
Well,
as many objections to a draw, right? He's just trying to get a draw.
well, because again, he's not trying to prove it, right? He sets it out
Not
at the
trying to prove
beginning.
it.
I just need to make this plausible.
Plausible.
And so this is
And I think
basically,
this is brilliantly plausible, right? He's kind of saying that what Jefferson is, I think contradicted. Now we're going to get to
does this
Lady
sort,
Lovelace, Lady Ada.
but does
I
this,
think Lady Ada beats. Let's get to her because I think she beats him. I think Turing. I think I side with Lady Ada, but I think Turing demolishes Professor Jefferson.
yeah, but this sort of feels like the floating teacup thing or the floating
You mean
teapot. And I
why?
just this idea that it's you can't argue what you can't disprove. Like, I don't know. This one, I'm
Well,
not.
quick note, he is being influenced, or rather, he's in conversation with the logical positivist, linguistic analyst Gilbert Ryle at Oxford. Uh, there is a whole tradition of logical positivism, analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy, I guess, is the more correct term for the British British school of philosophy. There is a whole school of philosophy that just says, you know, and it's in conversation with Wittgenstein too. Um, a whole school of philosophy that says, you know, the only thing you can do with philosophy is come up with semi-meaningful statements, right?
Hmm.
Or more precise statements. So yeah, he feels he's doing philosophy in these moments
Well, let's jump to Lady Lovelace's objection.
because I like her. I
Let's
like
do it.
her objection a lot.
Her argument is that a machine can't originate anything. It is
Okay.
only able to do what it's programmed to do. And so he says it differently, that a machine can never do anything new. And then he
That's
says
his
it still
concession.
differently.
That's his concession, but then he goes into something else.
He says it still differently. He says a machine can never take us by surprise. And this is where you're going to have to convince me of this one. Turing says that a glitch or a surprise
Mhm.
is a creative mental act, regardless of its origin.
Mhm.
Uh,
But Michael, I thought a little bit different. I was reading that a little bit differently. I was thinking that he was countering Lady Lovelace. Lady Lovelace says machines can't surprise us because they can only do what they're programmed. And I
right.
thought he said the glitch in the system, and we were talking about this in the pre-game show. You very accurately said this is a kind of anticipation of actor network theory.
That's how I,
The glitch in the system kindle surprise. And I thought, I mean, this was my reading. I thought this was his refutation or his argument against Lady Lovelace. He was saying, if the machine or if the actor network surprises me, and sometimes it surprises me by its incapacity, he wants to say that is, I'm sorry, Lady Lovelace, that is innovation, that is novelty.
yeah. Um, hmm, See, my objection to that is
Mhm.
that at no point in here
Mm.
has he gone down this we call it. This is not. Let me get you his language here. Okay.
Please,
So
please.
Lovelace's objection. In it, she states, quote, the analytical engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform.
To do. Right, right.
Right? It goes down a little bit further. It
So
could
machines
but
can think, let's just make it clear and to myself here to make
right?
sure I understand her. She's saying, okay, machines can't think because they can't do that novelty thing, right?
Right. So he says, I'm quoting him directly, a variant of Lady Lovelace's objection states that a machine can never do anything really new.
Mhm.
A better variant of the objection says that a machine can never take us by surprise. Goes a little bit further on and
Okay.
says, the view that machines cannot give rise to surprises is due, I believe, to a fallacy to which philosophers and mathematicians are particularly subject. This is the assumption that as soon as a fact is presented to a mind, all consequences of that fact spring to the mind simultaneously with it. It is a very useful assumption under many circumstances, but one too easily forgets that it is false. Okay, so I think I know how to articulate my hesitancy here. Lovelace's objection is that a computer or machine can only do what it's programmed to do. Said differently, a machine can never take us by surprise. Turing's response to that, he says that a surprise is a creative mental act regardless of its origin.
Right.
And I balk at that for two reasons. One is that this is he's ascribing creativity and a mental process to a machine, which by his own admission and by Lovelace's objection is defined by the limits of its programming. So I don't understand how we're like this borders on consciousness in a way that makes me kind of
And it
uncomfortable.
is kind of sneaky. He's like sneaking consciousness in where he hadn't been before, right?
Right.
Um, do you want to say anything more? Because I have a comment actually from I made a note from the excellent Stanford article They mention a particular critic of that passage that you read, Michael, and I would add it to it, but maybe you want to say something
No,
about it.
I've fumbled with this quite a bit. I'd love
No,
to
no,
let.
I think you brought up a really telling point, and as it happens, I had this sort of note from the Stanford Encyclopedia piece. Um, Bjorn, in fact, I think this was a co-authored article. Brings Jord was the lead article writer, but they seized on precisely this point. They were very critical. The Stanford writer, the writer of the article, actually pushes back against Brings Jord, but I am sort of on Brings Jord's side, and your comment suggests that you are as well. So, what does Brings Jord et al. Argue? They feel that this is a very weak argument, that his notion of surprise, and I think this is what you were pointing out, his notion of surprise is a very curious one, and they feel kind of a meager one. Is that really, and in a sense, a kind of specious argument, because by talking about surprise, now you're critical of that because in order to make that argument, it seems like he's sneaking in the consciousness machine that he
Mhm.
is that he's
Intent,
otherwise, yeah,
almost.
right, right. So that's a great, I think that's a great criticism. The Brings Joy doesn't mention that at all, do not mention that, but they also find something weird or specious about using surprise, which Turing does, as an objection, a coherent concept to counter a Lovelace. So quickly, briefly, they basically argue that what she really means by originality is creativity. And creativity is something, shades of Labatut, and this is really what they argue Lovelace is on about. And Turing doesn't go there with his articulation of surprise. That really what Lovelace is pointing to is the fact that the programming of the adding machine, there's no space for spontaneous, creative, novel expression. And his notion of surprise does not really counteract the hub of Lovelace's argument, which is programming cannot produce creative expression. Whereas humans,
Hmm.
just by speaking language, we're creating stuff. We cannot stop creating stuff.
The other hole in this argument, which just occurred to me, is that if you look at a moment of surprise that would result from, what we skipped one of his objections about disabilities, either an error of functioning or
Well,
error of
we'll get to
conclusion.
that in
But
sensory after this. After this,
if we
yeah.
were to look at one of these um, surprise moments
Mhm.
that he argues produces a creative act.
Right, 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 right.
This, first of all, flies in the face of his argument earlier when we were talking about pi and randomness to say, no, there's a pattern to everything. All you have to do
It
is look
does. It does. You're
backwards.
right. You're
All
right.
you have to do is look backwards to the moment of surprise, understand the source of
Right.
the error, which would then be logical. And
Not a
this is no
surprise. And
longer
not creative and not an innovation
no, and not a surprise.
and not a surprise. Yeah.
So,
I think this like I was saying, in my view, the Jefferson counter argument very strong. This counter argument problematic. Do you want to mention the other objections quickly?
no,
Because
I,
we
I,
want to
I
go to the
no, I think actually we're probably those were the two that we wanted to talk about at
yeah.
the. So he goes through a couple other ones. Um, not. I don't want to skip his discussion on ESP,
Well,
but
I did want to say this just to give a little bit of a flavor of the times that the go ahead and say
no,
the
no, I'm
basic thing on the
I'm
extra.
good. I'm good.
You don't want to touch the hot potato. Um, but my historical contextualizing point is merely the arguments about extrasensory perception. Um, he is guided by what he thinks is kind of cutting edge science in British circles. There was a great deal of investigation of telepathy and extrasensory perception that was going on, I think, in Oxford at this particular time. It was a kind of hotbed topic. And he was convinced that, just in the same way that further developments in computing and cybernetics would eventually create thinking machines, he was confident that more psychical research would unveil the fact, would prove that humans have extrasensory perception, in particular telepathy. And in this whack section, he basically says, well, if humans are telepathic, maybe machines are too. Okay, so that's basically what's going on there. But, it wasn't wacky for him. I mean, he thought that this was going to be the next scientific turn.
Yeah, that was tough for me. Um, are we good with ESP? Shall we?
Well, yeah, I'm certainly good with ESP. And then and the other one, what did we leave out?
So he goes, the end of this is really, I want
Hmm.
to pause for a second. I don't want to pause for too long because we've been going for a while here, but um he goes back, he talks about ESP, and then he returns back to Lovelace and says really that the issue that we have with the computers as thinking machines
Right.
and knowledge and learning machines is really one of programming,
Hmm.
and argues that we should program our computers the way that we teach children.
Hmm.
And I found this really interesting because his argument to me seemed to be in line with what we've actually done
In the
with
last
the,
75 years.
well, in the last 5, 10 years with the
Oh, wow.
language models
Okay.
and everything. Like this is one of
So
those,
ChatGPT, now we're sort of like moving ahead to ChatGPT and things like that.
yeah. And I don't know how, I at this point I've cherry picked a few of the lines from the last page of the article talking about what
I think we're moving.
constitutes.
You talked about us overstaying our welcome, but I think we're about to head it home here.
Okay, so one of the things that's interesting, so I'm just going to gloss this. This is sort of off the top of the head here, but in talking about teaching the machines in the way that we teach our children, it sort of seemed to anticipate the fact that rather than giving them a set series of rules and directives to follow, that we kind of start to try and understand that there's different kinds of rules that we can program in. And if we program these machines a certain way, the programmer themselves becomes less significant, that the machine can sort of learn to learn as it goes. So this is the last page of the article. This is some of the bits that hopefully will get us wrapping up here. He says intelligent behavior presumably consists in a departure from the completely disciplined behavior involved in computation, but a rather slight one, which does not give rise to random behavior or pointless repetitive loops. Another important result of preparing our machine for its part in the imitation game by a process of teaching and learning is that human fallibility is likely to be omitted in a rather natural way, i.e., without special coaching. Processes that are learned do not produce 100% certainty of result. If they did, they could not be unlearned. Do you have thoughts on that?
Want to follow your lead on this?
Well, I just
What
wanted
are
to
you
say
finding so? What are you finding so? Are you
this
finding you're finding this
idea.
prescient, right?
What's that?
you're finding this pressure.
Well, let me finish and then we can maybe we'll talk about the whole thing at once then. He further on he says now the learning process may be regarded as a search for a form of behavior which will satisfy the teacher or some other criterion.
Mhm.
As I hear this, he seems to be pointing directly towards really pattern recognitions and algorithms that this is what we're looking at. Um, we hope that the machines will eventually compete with all men in all purely intellectual fields. It can also be maintained that it is best to provide the machine with the best sense organs that money can buy and to teach it to understand and to speak English.
Okay, you want to talk more about, let me say something. Okay, let me take your bait and say something about the passage you read. And I'm sure you have something to say about that last sentence, but maybe I'll offer this as a kind of closing comment too. Um, I think you're dead on. I mean, dead right. And to say that this, he's been talking about simulacras of thinking and simulacras of learning and teaching, or that's where he ends. And when you think about it, the algorithm is, I'm thinking now of Amazon or Netflix and all
Right.
those algorithms, or YouTube or any of these things that give us what we want. They're kind of simulacrums of taste, single simulacras of reasonable of the act of judgment, right? Simulacras of individual choice. Like, okay, I don't know what you really want to hear right now, but I know you like this. And so it's probabilistic. It's possible. In fact, I would say highly likely that if you like to listen to Led Zeppelin, maybe you'll want to listen to Cream. Now that's that's not a real rational, deliberative choice on any levels, but it's close enough. And that's been the logic of this essay throughout, right? The algorithm is a masterful example of a close enough for rock and roll. It's close enough.
And that speaks to the problem that I have. I think on one hand, you can look at what Turing says here and say, you got it. You're right. I can't really offer a critique of this because we have had machines that can probably fool a decent percentage of the people a decent percentage of the time.
Mhm.
And if that is the game that we're playing,
Close enough.
then you got close enough, and that's good. The problem in this that I don't want to say the problem, the sticking point for me is that there is a space between learning and
Mhm.
thinking
Mhm.
and the simulacra of these processes,
Right. The close enoughness.
right?
Yeah.
Learning is akin to programming, thinking is akin to processing. And so,
See? But it's
so
not quite the same.
no, but it's close enough.
But
And and
and
that's
that's
the point. But
but that's this article. The article is against those fools who would say it's not quite the same.
I
Turing is
think
saying close enough, close enough, close enough, close enough. Shut up.
and
Yeah.
that's I think that's but see again, I think if you put it in time, it's fine because he's saying, look, is your toaster ever going to fool you into thinking that it's a baker, right? And you
No.
say, no, that's not going to happen, right? And you say, okay, but if I program your toaster a certain way, is it possible to conceive that it could one day fool someone? And you say, no, man, not my toaster.
And then he
But
says, "No, I think you're a toaster."
Right. But I've got other devices which can be programmed to
Oh,
mimic
well.
these
Okay, right.
same
Right. Right.
processes,
Right.
and that could happen.
And that could
So
happen. And
I
in
gotcha.
50 years, his magic day, in 50 years, it will. If you
Right.
think,
All we needed was the toaster oven, and
right.
then
Right.
suddenly we
Yeah.
have it all. So I think that it. works. My sticking point, I imagine yours as well, is that space between learning and thinking, which he
Right.
is
Right.
looking at in terms of he's I don't want to say he's playing fast and loose with his terms because I don't think he is. I
No,
think his
no, I
mission.
think, yeah, I would not want to make that criticism either.
No, I think that with the benefit of hindsight, we have the ability to distinguish between these terms because, to his point, the uh, the size of the data sets, the
Mhm.
ability, the
Mhm.
scale of processing is so massive in ways that would have been inconceivable
Sure,
that a
sure.
lot of the objections sort of you have to take with a grain of salt. And I think
Mhm.
that like his response to the objections grow stronger, I guess I would say.
Indeed, indeed. And, something to say, lest we think, lest we give the impression that, we're mocking him for that it's all a shell game or a
Not for a
word
minute.
game. Not for a minute. And in fact, I, speaking subjectively, um, the first read through for this painful for me. It's tedious, but then, when you get an idea to me subjectively, but rereading it, one understands his purpose, and his purpose is incredibly admirable. We sort of alluded to this earlier, and I think it's a good point to end on. Um, he's not interested, and in fact, he feels he cannot conclusively say, writing in 1950, that machine intelligence is a thing, will be a thing. It's a hope, it's a conjecture. And because he feels he cannot prove his argument, he does something I think very admirable in giving as much space to the point of tedium and
Hmm.
madness, but there is a kind of sublime purpose behind it. He wants to sound out all the objections because he knows that he is not arguing from certainty. So he wants to be as generous to his critics as possible.
Yeah. And I think when you consider that he's working from scratch
Working
and
from scratch.
and is at a
Absolutely.
disadvantage
Absolutely.
because these terms are nonsense
Absolutely.
in their time.
Am I allowed to end with my no, I don't well, I guess
Oh,
I'm going to do
yes.
it in my
Whatever it
screed.
is. Yes.
Well, just my screed, but it's a screed, and I don't really want to blame Alan Turing for this, but it is hard to read this essay. And maybe this is just a function of reading this essay at this moment, but we are living in Turing's world, and I don't like that world. And so it's very hard for me to read this article and say, oh my God, this guy, I feel that this guy is sort of complicit in being in the world that we inhabit now.
Is it Turing's world or did he just see the tea leaves?
Well, I mean, that would be the defense. Like that would be the reason why I don't want to make a screed on this, because the counter argument would be that the reduction, the shrinking
The reason
to
I ask,
detach did well, let me give you kind of try to give you a real brief answer to that question. So the general project here is to detach intelligence from humans.
hmm,
And when I say I don't like the world that this essay created, I feel that the detachment of intelligence and rationality from humans isn't just something that's happening in cheap ChatGPT. I think it's happening in other ways in algorithms. It's happening in other ways in politics. It's happening in other ways in our social discourse. There seems to be a systemic denigration of or a reduction of rationality and intelligence, and a separation from the human. Or and Okay, so that's what I'm decrying. Now, to your point, yeah. Should I blame Alan Turing for this? No,
well,
because obviously it's a social system that finds something convenient in
so
Turing's theory and has ran with it.
I,
That's
I
maybe a better
what
description of it, right?
I'll say two things. I think that one, and I too read the Stanford article, and you realize that, and I read the entirety of that bad boy.
Oh, wow.
Um,
You're
there
crazy.
are a number of other people who are working at similar ends, and some who are
Right.
actually ahead of him.
Indeed.
So I think that, and I don't say that it's not Turing's fault, it's somebody else's fault. I think that the world was going this way
Mhm.
anyway. I would make one slight change, and it might seem a bit pedantic, but rather than saying we're trying to detach intelligence from humans,
Mhm.
I would say that I think what we're probably trying to do is inscribe it into the machines.
I
And
like it.
in doing so, you've used the word simulacra a number of times. The
Too much.
problem is that as we've done that, I think that in this sort of regression to the lowest common denominator, to the ease, let me find the easy point. What we've done is we've abdicated our responsibilities to
Oh,
be
that's a great
thoughtful
way of putting it.
citizens. And
Great
so
way of putting it.
I don't know that the fault lies anywhere other than with
Ourselves.
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 And this is one of those situations where you say, "Well, you get what you get, you know? Um, and
Let's end with Dr.
that's
Rapichi's
that's not
sage
uplifting,
words.
but I don't know. Maybe for the philosophers, the philosophers among you can debate that one.
I thought you were
Um,
going to get French on me and say, for the philosophes among you.
I can't
Remember,
do that.
you are to
Not
blame.
not tonight. I can't do that anymore. Barry, thank you so much. This was really enjoyable.
Thank you, Michael. Always enjoyable. Um, is this the end? Sayonara to AI?
I'm never willing to commit to the end, but it might be.
All right. Thanks
All right,
again,
we'll
Michael.
talk
Appreciate
soon.
it. Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.